It's a pleasure to be back at the Rubin Museum, and I thank you and Tim McHenry and Lynette Sauer and all others of the Rubin family for your hospitality in inviting me here again. And I thought that what I would do, perhaps not something that commands household familiarity. And so before I go into the more precise topic that I think exemplifies some of the dynamic interface between empire and religion in this period, I thought I would just very informally introduce some aspects of what is it that we mean by the Tibetan Empire. I should say that I think when this series of talks was originally, excuse me, sir? I'm getting a flash of your light in my eyes and it's distracting. Thank you. When this series was first planned, I believe that the intention was to have the lecture series in chronological order, which would have been nice, but it wasn't convenient for all of those involved. And so the result is that the present talk, which falls in the beginning of the material covered in the exhibition, is actually the last in the series. So you have things around backward, but if you are following the exhibition upstairs in the 6th floor, you would, on entering, immediately turn to the right, and in the section dealing with the first period of the 7th, 8th, 9th century, you would be right on the materials connected with the subject matter I will introduce today. Okay, so we can start with a brief map lesson, and of course, I think all of you are familiar with the broad area that represents the Tibetan uplands in the heart of Asia. And you have this sort of fish-like shaped darkened area, which is territory above 3,000 meters. And it's that corresponds primarily to the Tibetan plateau. In this area, the Tibetan kingdom that arose in the 4th, 5th, 6th centuries, roughly, first had its center right down here in what today would be southern Tibet. And by about the beginning of the 7th century, by around 600, the rulers of this area had expanded to cover an area in here and had just conquered the area around present-day Lhasa. And then successively throughout the 7th century, the Tibetan kingdom grew to become an empire through, first of all, its conquests of what is Western Tibet, the region that was then known as Zhangzhung, then moving eastward to the parts of the Tibetan plateau that we now think of as the Qinghai uplands of the Tibetan plateau, and then moving into the Silk Road regions of what is today Xinjiang province in China. By the beginning of the 9th century, the period on which I'll be mostly focusing, they had started to swing over, whoops, got the wrong button here, swing over threatening China itself. In fact, very briefly in the 8th century, the Tibetans actually invaded the Chinese capital and placed a puppet emperor on the throne for a short period of time. Just to review, the first period of the Tibetan rise, you have it here, and you'll all be quizzed on this on exiting, so remember these dates. So in 608, as the Tibetan kingdom was consolidating itself, it sent its first diplomatic mission to China, then ruled by the Sui dynasty. In 617 or possibly 29. There's some conflict about dates. We have the ascension of Sonsen Gampo, who is the ruler who is credited with really founding Tibet as an imperial power, who actually effects the conquest of West Tibet and begins to threaten the Chinese presence in Central Asia. And the title of the Tibetan kings, by the way, because I will use it on several occasions throughout this talk, was Tsembo, a word literally meaning, well, something like firm and powerful. But like the Russian title Tsar, it is the unique title of the Tibetan ruler. Okay, so we have 630s, the conquest of Jiangshung. 640 again, the Tibetans send an important mission to China that comes back with a Chinese princess, Wencheng, as a bride for their emperor. The Tang dynasty ruling China had the practice of trying to buy off peace with threatening neighboring powers by sending princesses to marry into their royal families. And an example was Wencheng's marriage to Sonsen Gampo. Sonsen himself dies in 650, but the Princess Wencheng continues to live in Tibet until 680, and we know that she remained actually quite a powerful and significant figure in Tibetan affairs at the time. According to long-standing Tibetan legend, if you will, Sonsen adopted Buddhism owing to the influence of Wencheng. There was probably some presence of Buddhism that came into Tibet at this time, but its extent is in doubt. What certainly occurred, however, is that we have the creation of the Tibetan system of writing under Sonsen Gampo, and also the formalization of Tibetan laws, measures, principles of administration, and so forth. So he and his court play a very fundamental role in defining Tibet as an imperial and legal power. The region in South Tibet from which the dynasty arose was the Yarlung Valley, which you see here, dominated by the old palace of Yumbu Tlagang, which according to legend had been the seat of the Tibetan kings in the 4th, 5th, 6th century, and so forth. Of course, it's been rebuilt many times, and the version of the fortress that one sees here is not at all what existed in the 5th century. Sonsen Gampo and the immediate members of his court are represented in an old chapel in the interior of the Potala Palace in Lhasa. It's in doubt exactly when this chapel was created and to what period its statuary date, but you see here the Emperor Sonsen Gampo as he's classically depicted with a little image of the Buddha Amitabha arising from his turban, because according to tradition, Sonsen was the emanation of the Bodhisattva of compassion, Avalokiteshvara, who is always marked in the iconography by the presence of the Buddha Amitabha in his topknot. The foreign princesses of the emperor, who married the emperor, became his queens, are represented here in the same chapel. The Princess Wencheng, who we do know from the historical record, and the rather mysterious Nepalese Princess Brakuti, who, well, there's some debate in the scholarship as to whether she was a real individual or added in later legend. It's certainly plausible that she was a real person, as Tibet did dominate Nepal during this period. The Princess Wencheng is particularly famed for having brought with her from China to Tibet a particularly sacred image of the Buddha Shakyamuni called the Jo, that became the central object of the first major temple of Tibet, the Tsulakang, or the Jokang as it's now called, located in the heart of Lhasa. And the image that you see here, the Zhou Shakyamuni, that Wencheng is said to have imported to Tibet, is regarded as the most highly venerated image in the Tibetan world. And for almost all Tibetans, it's an obligatory pilgrimage to at least do homage to the Lhasa Zhou on one occasion in one's life or more. Okay, the second lesson you'll be quizzed on concerns the second phase of the Tibetan Empire. And we see that another Chinese princess arrived in Tibet at this time. The princess Jincheng, who married the future emperor Tri Detsukten when he was still crown prince, and a few years later, when he was crowned as Tembo, she of course became the queen, one of the queens of Tibet. And in fact, for the introduction of Buddhism to Tibet, Jincheng, though she's not much mentioned, is really much more important than her great aunt, Princess Wencheng. We know from fairly copious detail in the record that the Princess Jincheng was very actively a sponsor of Buddhism and sought to ensure that Buddhist rites were introduced to the Tibetan nobility of the time. However, in 739, there was an outbreak of plague in Tibet, probably bubonic plague, to judge from what we find in the record. And the Princess Jincheng was one of its victims. And this led to a very powerful anti-Buddhist reaction, with much of the nobility who had recently taken an interest in Buddhism being convinced that the plague was due to their fiddling around with a foreign religion that had no business in their land. And so you have a strong anti-Buddhist reaction that sets in. A few years later, one of the other queens gives birth to a prince who becomes Chisong Detsen, one of the greatest rulers of Tibet, who ascends to the throne in 755 when a rebellion deposes his father. And again, this is an interesting thing about Tibetan power at the time and its dynamic, that those who fomented this coup d'etat, they, instead of installing themselves in power, they nonetheless installed the rightful prince. What is demonstrated here, and we see this kind of thing occurring frequently in the Tibetan imperial period, is that the possibility of seeking to overturn the rule through regicide was something that certainly did occur and was practiced by some factions, but the idea of usurping the entire dynasty was completely out of bounds. It was generally recognized that whatever was done, authority would rest with the same dynastic family. And so for that reason, these rebellions that occur from time to time in the Tibetan Empire served not to bring in a new dynasty, but simply to advance, if you will, the process of succession. At any rate, Chisong Detsen is enthroned, and in 762, when he's about 20 years of age, he begins to learn something of Buddhism and decides that those who had sought to remove Buddhism from Tibet had been on the wrong side of the spiritual crisis in the Tibetan aristocracy during the period. And he then adopts Buddhism not only as his own personal religion, but very swiftly moves to impose it as the religion of state. One thing that's very interesting here is that the year of his adoption of Buddhism is the year of his invasion of the Chinese capital. And what immediately one might appreciate from this that I think is perhaps not quite in harmony with popular conceptions of Buddhism at the present time is that for these people, Buddhism as a religious choice was not at all incompatible with the harshness of imperial expansion and rule. And we'll see later on when I turn to the Temple of the Turquoise Grove some indication of how this apparent conflict was to some extent resolved. At any rate, 779, we have the foundation of Samye Monastery, the first actual Tibetan monastery. And in 781, the conquest of Dunhuang, an important Buddhist center on the Silk Road, and that I will speak more of here. And finally, in 797, Chisong Detsen abdicates. Okay, going back just over this history quickly and some of its imagery, the first temple founded by Chide Tsukchen and the Princess Jincheng is in southern Tibet. It's a temple called Unkeru. And you see just a little bit of this statue here that actually represents the Princess Jincheng as a bodhisattva. This temple, though it's preserved at the present time, interestingly never enjoyed the same kind of status as a place of cult and pilgrimage that the Zhoukang in Lhasa, of course, did enjoy. We have a lovely image of Chisong Detsen from the collection of the Potala Palace. The Samye Monastery, which was the first actual monastery in Tibet. I'm referring on some occasions to temples and some occasions to monasteries. And the distinction is really that a temple is essentially an edifice that houses a shrine, where that may include images, books, and so forth, but that has, with the exception perhaps of one or two monks assigned to be attendants, no full monastic community that practices its own rites of ordination or has monastic educational facilities and so forth. Whereas a monastery such as Samye was a much larger institutional concern with several colleges, a translation bureau, and a fairly elaborate administrative apparatus. The period of the foundation of Samye is associated, of course, in legend with a figure, Padmasambhava, an Indian teacher, who from the historical record remains very obscure, but in later Tibetan tradition is perhaps the single figure the Tibetans most closely associate with the period of the Tibetan Empire and the spread of Buddhism within it. And then final bit of cue cards, the last phase of the Tibetan Empire in the 9th century. We have a series of rulers in the immediate succession of Chisong Detsen, his son Chide Songtsen, followed by his son Chitsuk Detsen or Rinpochen, under whom the Tibetan Empire reaches its greatest extent. As we'll see in further detail in a moment, the military and political crises that are tied to Tibet's expansion lead ultimately to a treaty arrangement with China that's concluded in 822. Rinpochen is himself assassinated in 838. The empire is then governed by a figure named Udumtsen or Langdharma, who is infamous in history as an opponent of Buddhism, though again, there are difficulties in the interpretation of the actual history. It may have been no more than a reduction of funds for the support of the monasteries that was in fact involved in his reign. But for whatever reasons, he too was assassinated after only 4 years of rule. And at that, the Tibetan Empire begins to enter into a period of fairly rapid disintegration, though it still takes about a half century before it really completely departs. At any rate, in 851, the Chinese governor Zhang Yizhao reconquers the northeastern part of the Tibetan Empire, present-day Gansu, including the Dunhuang region, and so forth. Just quickly to go through some imagery connected with this last phase, we have one of the important temples, it's a very small one, but nonetheless considerably important, founded by Trisong Detsen's son, Tride Songtsen, the Urusha temple to the northeast of Lhasa, which was had a very prominent series of inscriptional stelae, most of which are severely damaged and scattered about the property at the present time, but they were well preserved until the period just before the Cultural Revolution in China. And we do have the full texts of those inscriptions that are among the major sources for the history of the period. For the Tibetans, for later Tibetan historical memory, 3 of the kings of the empire are particularly prominent for their associations with Buddhism. Songtsen Gampo, the founder of the empire, Trisong Detsen, who founded the Samye Monastery, and Lalpa Chen, under whom the empire arrived at its greatest extent. Okay, now, here we are with a view of the Tibetan Empire during this period of its expansion under Lalpa Chen. And the regions that we're mostly going to be concerned with are up in the northeast here, around Dunhuang and Anxi Yulin. The 2 names on the map that you should bear in mind are these, Dunhuang and Anxi Yulin, both of which I'll speak about. One interesting thing about this map, by the way, that you probably should be aware of. This map comes from the official Chinese historical atlas. In many popular Chinese publications or publications from Chinese scholars who are not specialists in this history, you will often see it said that with the marriage of Wencheng to Songtsen Gampo, Tibet became part of China. As you see from the Chinese historical atlas itself, this is not accepted in serious Chinese historical study. The Tibetan Empire here is shown as a distinct geographical political entity, and there is no ambiguity about it. Tang China is over here in green. Right. So this is a rather important point to bear in one's consideration of Chinese publications about Tibet. They operate on 2 levels, a kind of popular level that very much simplifies the history, and a more serious level of scholarship that is more closely in line with what historical scholarship concludes about these things. Okay, where am I here? With the conquests, we've seen that with the conquest of the Tibetan Empire during the 7th through 9th centuries, large parts of the Silk Road area came under Tibetan control, at least intermittently. And owing to the challenge this created for neighboring powers, including China's Tang dynasty, the emerging Uyghur Turk Empire, and expanding Islamic powers further west, the Tibetans found themselves in an almost constant state of war to secure their frontiers. Dunhuang and its surroundings, which were of key importance in the Gansu corridor region, came under Tibetan domination during the 780s. And although Tibetan political power collapsed in the region after 851, as we have seen, when the Tibetan Empire disintegrated and the army of the return to righteousness under Governor Zhang took control of the region, Tibetan culture continued to play an important role in the area during the following centuries, with Tibetan continuing to be the lingua franca in this region, at least through the end of the first millennium. The best evidence we have for the cultural life of this region during the time comes, as it is well known, from the Buddhist cave temples of Dunhuang and the textual and pictorial record known from the abundant manuscripts and paintings discovered there, thanks above all to the discovery at the very beginning of the 20th century of the so-called library cave, Dunhuang Cave 17, by the Taoist priest Wang, who you see here. As news of Wang's discovery circulated, European explorers of Central Asia were drawn to the site, most famously the British Indologist and archaeologist Mark Orlstein and the French sinologist Paul Pelliot. And Pelliot is shown here in Cave 17 itself, working through the piles of manuscripts and paintings that were found there. As a result of the activities of Stein and Pelliot there, the majority of the manuscripts and artworks of Cave 17 were sent to London and Paris, where they remain today. Smaller collections were acquired in St. Petersburg, Kyoto, Beijing, and elsewhere. So one finds a scattering of Dunhuang materials virtually all over Europe, America, and parts of Asia as well. But they tend to be just isolated, either texts or a single painting, rather than these very considerable collections that we find, particularly in Paris and London. The Dunhuang archive includes materials in many of the languages used in medieval Central Asia, including Sanskrit, Sogdian, Tocharian, Khotanese, various forms of Old Turkish, and even Hebrew. But the collection is far and away dominated by just two languages, Tibetan and Chinese, reflecting the preeminent political and cultural agencies of the Dunhuang region during the half-millennium in which the collection came to be constituted. Scholars examining the treasures Stein and Pelliot had obtained soon came to recognize that the Tibetan materials had a special value in that they shed light on a period in Tibet's history and the history of the greater Tibet that was constituted by the old Tibetan Empire, that was only dimly perceived in the extant historical record, and that had in fact been virtually forgotten. One of the notable pioneers in the study of this unique Tibetan record was the British archivist Frederick W. Thomas, shown here with the renowned Italian Tibetanist Giuseppe Tucci. Thomas, among many other contributions, attempted the first decipherments of the old Tibetan historical works and chronicles from Dunhuang in collaboration with French scholars Jacques Bacot and Charles-Gustave Toussaint. The history of the Tibetan language has been such that for many centuries now, the Tibetan written language has been enormously stable. It's basically been in its grammatical forms and in its spelling system and so forth, virtually frozen for the past 800-900 years. But prior to that, there existed an old Tibetan language, and reading it is something like, for a modern English speaker, reading Old or Middle English, or for someone who knows French, reading Old French and so forth. It's not quite evident. And at the time that these documents were discovered, there was basically no guide to reading Old Tibetan. It was Thomas who was one of the pioneering figures in coming to clarity about how this language, aspects of which still remain mysterious, was indeed to be read. Now, here I wish to focus upon just one of Thomas's many contributions. And this was his recognition of the importance of, and his initial attempts to interpret, an incomplete manuscript containing a collection of prayers, all composed to honor the consecration of a particular temple named as the Temple of the Treaty of Degayutsal, the Turquoise Grove. It was one of the manuscripts in the London collection, of which you see a folio here. It's now cataloged as number 751, that first piqued Thomas's interest. And some selections from Thomas's translation of one of these prayers, offered by the most important colonial officer of the Tibetan Empire in the Northeast, the figure known as the pacification minister, or Delun, may be cited here. And I just want to point out one feature of the manuscript to you here. You'll notice that the main text is in black, but that there's a rubricated line, a line written in red here. This is at the head of each of the prayers offered to celebrate the consecration of this temple. There's a brief line in red that names the figure offering the prayer. So in this case, it specifies here in red that the following prayer is offered by this figure, the Delun, the pacification minister, who would have, for simple comparison, in the hierarchy of the Tibetan Empire, the Delun would have been roughly similar to the Viceroy of India under the system of Indian imperial rule, right? So he was virtually a potentate unto himself, but still under the broad imperial framework, at the apex of which was the Tsembo, the Tibetan emperor. And so here is a selection from the Delun's prayer as translated by Thomas. Established in his place, the pure, his high kingdom above great rivers and at the foot of high snow mountains, his divine majesty, the Tsembo, is beyond other kings, manifestly great and permanent. Of ancestry thus rivaling the gods, his divine majesty, the Tsembo Chitsuk Dezen, that is to say Relpachen, in body firm knit, in mind divinely endowed, with due foundation of all monasteries, gives joy to the people and even all the gods and nagas of heaven and earth. At the time when, through his great compassion towards us upright people, the great authority of his government has spread and flourished, protecting us with respect in a manner resembling heaven, there came into power certain exalted counselors of state, the great counselor Uncle Chisumje and the great Uncle Sazang, these two, humbling the might of enemies and setting them in the bosom of the state, by the power and influence of their stern commands, they tamed all the border kings, such as those of China, the Uyghur, Nanzhao being the southern kingdom that occupied the area that's now Yunnan province in China. So they tamed the kings, China, Uyghur, Nanzhao, and others, who until then ventured and made effort for dominion. And they cut short their hopes. After a long time, as though heaven were realized in men's mind, some several states, respectfully heeding the orders of the high counselors of Tibet, made this great concordat of states, whereby, to say naught of ephemeral good and happiness, both in present and future, there is among friend and foe alike reason profound indeed for extolling and celebrating the bosom of the state. May this great publicly enacted concordat, known and witnessed by the three jewels and by all gods and nagas, stand for all time unimpaired and firm. Through the great merit thereof, may his divine majesty, the honored Tsembo Chitsuk Dezen, and the great counselors of state, Uncle Chisumje and Uncle Tlazang and the rest, and all beings cleansed from the double darkness and fulfilling their store of merit and wisdom, finally in supreme perfected enlightenment attain to Buddhahood. In respect of the choice of this place as site for the foundation of the monastery erected on the Dega turquoise wood plain of the treaty, and for biennial convention of the three great kingdoms, and for great foundations, the site being, moreover, one fully blessed by Aryas of old, may it furthermore, through a foundation in respect of such great good realized at one time, be even more manifestly of great merit and auspiciousness, whereas formerly, in the time when China and the Uyghur were not in accord and harmony with the state. The firm helmeted prince and the wise heroic counselors, in the ardor of their warlike skill, smote at the foe, and by the mighty power of large armies, laid low enemy cities, won battles, conquered countries, slew the people, and so forth. May the sin of severing the lives of many men and cattle, and of taking what was not given, be altogether dominated by the splendor and power of this great merit, and be dissolved and washed away. Okay, Thomas characterized the diction of these prayers as magniloquent. No doubt, as someone who himself was brought up as a servant of the British Empire in India, he had some sensibility in regard to the magniloquence of imperial usage, and sought to reflect that in his translation. Thomas at first mistakenly believed that the text was referring to events of the mid-8th century, but soon recognized that the Tibetan ruler mentioned, Sembochi Tsukdetsen, was to be identified with the 9th century monarch Relpachen, and that the treaty, or concordat, as he called it, could be related to the Sino-Tibetan Treaty of 822, recorded in the bilingual so-called uncle-nephew pillar edict in Lhasa. And this is a very important document, as you see in Chinese on the right and Tibetan on the left, that records the understanding that China and Tibet arrived at in 822 concerning settling disputes on their frontiers in the Northeast. And we know also a great deal about this treaty and the negotiations that led to it through the Tang dynasty historical records that devote considerable attention to this, it having been a particularly important accord in that it reduced, for the Tang dynasty in particular, what had been one of the major defensive outlays that the empire had had to attend to. Now, one problem that Thomas had in his interpretation of these documents that he never had satisfactorily resolved was the significance of the toponym Dega. Going here, the temple is named the Dega Yutzel Temple of the Treaty, the Dega Turquoise Grove Temple of the Treaty. This phrase, Dega, completely eluded him. Thomas also became aware at some point that a missing part of the manuscript, though not the entire missing beginning of the manuscript, was in fact to be found in the Paris collection. The manuscript had been somehow split up, and Stein got one part and Pelliot got another. And we have it divided between the Paris and London collections. Now, this part occurs before the section that I showed you earlier with the red heading of the pacification minister's prayer. And because the manuscript is ordered hierarchically, that is, we go from the most important figures offering their prayers to persons lower down, we know that this section in Paris was coming from someone higher up in the hierarchy, even than the pacification minister. But unfortunately, we lack the very beginning of this section, so we don't know exactly whom. My own hypothesis is that it's probably from a monk minister named Palgi Yunten, who was essentially the Richelieu of Tibet during the period, a very prominent figure in Tibetan affairs. But we have no clear proof of that. In any case, my translation of this entire rather lengthy and extremely ornate prayer appears in a volume I co-edited entitled Sources of Tibetan Tradition, and it's quite long, so I won't read it all here. But there's one passage in this section that we should look at closely. That's rather fascinating. And the prayer reads, "For all those who have given precious aid, their merit will not go to waste, but an image of that great merit will arise in the heavens of the gods. The causes and conditions for the arising of this image being the construction of the temple, the bodily image of Buddha Vairochana installed in its center. By means of the emanational body, he thoroughly matures sentient beings of the world realms of the 10 directions. Installed, too, is the bodily image of Buddha Amitabha, whose field is best among those of all Buddhas, where even the names of the 3 evil destinies are unknown. In that field, adorned with all perfect world-transcending happiness, he acts on behalf of sentient beings. Because his compassion is especially great, just by calling his name, all sins are purified, and one is blessed to be born in that Buddha field. Installed, too, is the bodily image of Buddha Maitreya, who now in the Tushita heaven, in a jeweled mansion adorned with all divine ornaments, matures all the offspring of the gods, and so abides. Delighting in the bliss of divine attributes throughout the ocean of world systems, that Buddha Maitreya in future time will encourage the wishes and aspirations of all, and his name will accord with its meaning, love, so that by the power of great compassion, all will be embraced by his love. Also installed is the retinue of 8 great bodhisattvas, the 2 wrathful deities, etc. Also installed are the shrines of the lords and protectors of the 4 directions." Now, because we find in these lines some clear indications regarding the iconography of the Temple of the Treaty, this raised the question for me of whether a closely similar temple might be found among the many surviving Buddhist cave temples of the Dunhuang region. A possible answer became apparent to me when I visited the National Historical Museum in Beijing in the year 2000. For the museum to mark the centennial of Dao Shi Wang's discovery of the library cave, held a special exhibition that included 4 full-size reproductions of caves that were especially prized for their artistic achievement. One of these was Anshi Yulin Cave number 25, and on entering the replica, I experienced a startling moment of recognition. For there before me was the Buddha Vairochana, flanked by Amitabha and Maitreya, just as described in the prayer, and said to date from the period of the Tibetan occupation of the region during the early 9th century. Let us review then the iconography of Anshi Yulin Cave 25 in more detail. And so if you enter the cave this way, and you have Vairochana and the 8 bodhisattvas here, and the Buddha field of Amitabha here, and the Buddha field of Maitreya over here. It may be noted that the excavation of Cave 25 is unusually large and precise. This, together with the exceptional quality of the painting within it, suggests that it enjoyed sponsorship from highly placed agencies and was certainly not commissioned as a modest family shrine, as were the majority of the cave temples we find in the Dunhuang region. On entering the antechamber, we find 2 surviving murals among those of the guardians of the 4 directions, Virupaksha and Virudaka. The front wall of the main chamber on either side of the entryway is adorned with the bodhisattvas Samantabhadra and Manjushri, while the chamber is dominated by a central image of the Buddha Vairochana. This statue, however, is a late addition, a Qing dynasty addition to the cave, and has no bearing at all on the original iconography. The rear east wall, on the other hand, depicting Vairochana and the 8 bodhisattvas, clearly indicates the temple's Tibetan origins during the early 8th century. And we have, at the present time, the Buddha Vairochana and 4 of the Bodhisattvas preserved. The other 4 Bodhisattvas were there still in the 1940s when a photographer named James Law visited Dunhuang and extensively photographed the caves in the region. The archive, the Law family archive, is preserved at Princeton University. And as his photographs show, the wall was already disintegrating in the 40s. We don't know exactly when that part of the wall collapsed, but probably it did so in the late 40s or during the 1950s. Okay, the south wall is dedicated to a prominent theme in Dunhuang Buddhist art, that is to say the paradise of the Buddha Amitabha, as described in the Sukhavati Vyuha Sutra. In the words of our prayer, the Buddha field that is best among those of all Buddhas. And opposite this on the north wall is the prophecy of the coming of Buddha Maitreya. A variety of research in recent decades has established the great importance of Buddha Vairochana for the Buddhism of the Tibetan imperial court, as well as the close iconographic correspondence between the precise form of Vairochana we find in Anshi Yulin Cave 25 and other early 9th century Tibetan images, as we see in this very rare example of a surviving Tibetan imperial bronze. And as you look at these surviving 9th century Tibetan Vairochanas, it's very remarkable how well standardized they are. If you look at just the lay of the robe here, the armlets, the braids on the shoulders, and so forth, the correspondences are very remarkable. And indeed, in the robes, we find even the same floral patterns. It's clear that we're dealing with a very highly standardized iconography reflecting a pronounced degree of centralization. Elsewhere, as at Denmachak in the far eastern region of Kham, seen here on the right, we find the entire configuration of Vairochana and the 8 Bodhisattvas carved in relief in stone. And also, unfortunately, this is not a very good image of the Denmachak reliefs, but here again, if you look at details, including the patterns in the robes and so forth, they correspond very, very closely to what we see at Anshi Yulin. The icons in question have been recently studied in considerable detail in a monograph by Michelle Wang, Mandalas in the Making, and any who are interested in pursuing this question of the iconographic connections here, I recommend to take a look at this fine study. And as you see, we have here another painting of the same form of Vairochana from another cave in Dunhuang. There's actually a fairly considerable corpus that's now been identified. We may note briefly that despite the presence of cartouches that were, let me see if I can, I have to go back. Okay, you'll notice that next to all of these figures you have like a T. This is a double cartouche, and the horizontal bar on top was intended for a Tibetan inscription, because Tibetan is written horizontally, and the vertical section for Chinese, because Chinese is written vertically. And we find this all over Dunhuang during the period of the Tibetan imperial domination of Dunhuang, that we have these curious T-shaped cartouches. Usually they're not filled in. Sometimes they are. The artists left them with the intention that a scribe should later come in and fill them out, but often that never happened. But still, it's a clear indication of the Tibetan period provenance of these works. There's in fact only one Tibetan inscription in our cave, and this is a late graffito. As you can see, it was written into a vertical cartouche that was intended for a Chinese inscription, not a Tibetan inscription. And it has no clear bearing on the temple. It was probably 10th century graffito. And indeed, most of the inscriptions surviving in the cave are graffiti of the 10th century, some written in Chinese, some written in Uyghur Turkish, and so forth. In addition to the iconography, I adduced several additional details within the prayers of Dega Yüdsel that, taken together, convinced me that the famed Temple of the Treaty was none other than Anshi Yulin Cave 25. And after I first published my results in 2004, they aroused considerable interest and indeed controversy in China. And I provided a much expanded account of my findings in 2009. However, as I was completing work on the latter publication, I finally became aware of the solution to the one remaining problem that had not so far been solved, and this only gave rise to new problems. From Thomas's time on, as I had mentioned, no one had found a satisfactory interpretation of the toponym most frequently encountered in the prayers, Dega. My own analysis of the name of the temple had focused, up until that time, on the possible correspondence between the Tibetan Yüdsel, the Turquoise Grove, and the Chinese Yulin. That is the name of the Anshi Yulin's site. But for years, Dega had me stumped, as it had others who had worked on this. The suggestions that it might be a Tibetan toponym formed with ga as a final syllable, which is often the case in northeastern Tibet, seemed to me to be unconvincing. An answer finally emerged when I decided to explore the possibility that Dega was not a Tibetan word at all, but a transcription of a foreign name, in particular a place name in Middle Chinese. I'd already mentioned we have this distinction between Old Tibetan and Modern Tibetan, similar to Old or Middle English and Modern English and so forth. Well, in Chinese, because you're using a character system in which there are no differences of spelling, the question of what Middle or Ancient Chinese was like is deeply puzzling and has involved a considerable amount of linguistic research to attempt to reconstruct old pronunciations of Chinese. And so if you have in a 8th or 9th century Tibetan document a term you think might be Chinese, you cannot try to interpret it on the basis of any modern Chinese dialect. You have to go back to reconstructions of Chinese as it was spoken in the 7th and 8th century and see if you can find something. And indeed, on undertaking that exercise, I found it to be fruitful because Dega, it became clear to me, was probably none other than what in Middle Chinese was pronounced something like Daiga. And this in modern Chinese is Daxia, which is an important district now named Linxia in southern Gansu. So that's where Daxia is. This coheres perfectly well with a variety of other geographical evidence that we find. And it's now possible to say with some certainty that the treaty temple was not Anshi Yulin 25, but must have been, in fact, located in this region of Linxia in southern Gansu. But where does this leave my earlier hypothesis? I think I succeeded in showing you a fair amount of rather intriguing correspondence between the text of the prayers and Anshi Yulin 25, which, as we've seen, was dating to the right period of time, has the right iconography, is geographically in a region very closely connected with the events discussed. Can it be that it has just no relation whatsoever with the Temple of the Treaty? Well, one of the remarkable coincidences apparently connecting the two, besides the matters I've discussed, is to be found in an official title that we find in the prayers. I'll pass over that. This is, again, one of these prayers with you have the red rubrications indicating who offered the prayers. And we have a prayer offered by the Kiliarch of Chuktsam. Okay? And interestingly, we know from other documents from Dunhuang that the Kiliarch of Chuktsam was in fact the officer charged with the upkeep of the Yulin temples. Right, this is a rather remarkable coincidence. So we have one of the figures, at least one of the official roles, that is involved with the consecratory prayers for the Temple of the Treaty, who is also known to have been the figure responsible for the Anchi Yulin site, where we find Cave 25. Okay? So my hypothesis now is that the temple, rather than being the actual Temple of the Treaty, was a replica thereof, that the Kiliarch of Chuktsam, having participated in the edification of the Temple Treaty, basically said, I want one of those too, and created a cave temple based on similar iconography. Okay, now in the time that remains, I'd like to wrap, I'm actually probably over time, but I'll go very quickly, and just say something about some aspects of the iconographic program of Anchi Yulin 25 that I think are revealing about, we're supposed to be talking about the intersections of faith and empire, faith and imperial power, and I think the iconography itself informs us in some ways about this. In my book, The Tibetan Assimilation of Buddhism, I discussed briefly a phenomenon that I characterized as the imperial cosmopolitanism of the old Tibetan monarchy, its insistence upon the particular excellence and authority of the Tibetan Sempo, while at the same time embracing broad aspects of the surrounding cultures. And I believe that this is very well represented in the program in Cave 25. To begin, the privileged authority of the Tibetan imperial order is, as we have seen, clearly inscribed here in a particular form of Buddha Vairochana, accompanied by the 8 bodhisattvas. While flanking this, as here in the south wall, the visual register becomes notably Chinese. Some have even thought that this suggests that the murals were the work of different workshops at different times, but in fact there is no reliable evidence that this might have been so. There is clear iconographic difference, of course, but when we compare the palette, the draftsmanship, and according to one art historian with whom I consulted about this, even the brush strokes, no reason emerges not to suppose that the very same artisans were responsible for all 3 of the major panels, the Vairochana panel, the Amitabha, and the Maitreya panel. Telltale features also point to this conclusion. For example, the remarkable inclusion of a Tibetan wedding scene in Maitreya's Divine Field. But above and beyond the contrasting Tibetan and Chinese Buddhist worlds that we find inscribed in Cave 25, we must recognize that these icons betoken a wider international order of ultimately Indian origin, but extending throughout much of the known world. Thus, we find virtually the entire iconography stipulated in the prayers, Vairochana, the bodhisattvas, the 4 protectors, the wrathful deities, and so forth, in a famous traveling shrine of possibly Kashmiri origin. The Indian background, moreover, is known not only from such texts as the Vajrashekara Tantra, but also from the surviving artwork, including, as we see here, a clay-molded image from northeastern India and a mandala carved in stone at Ellora. And if we take into consideration somewhat varying forms of Vairochana as well, we find this Buddha associated during the same period with royal cult as far away as Java, or in China, as we see in the reliquary of the Fa Min Se, or in Japan. Lesser details speak of the internationalization of Cave 25 as well. The jewel-bearing elephant we see here, of course, has nothing to do with China's distant memories of its own indigenous pachyderms. As a six-tusker, it can only be seen as the mount of the Indian god Indra, despite the costume of the figure accompanying it. But elsewhere, the register is more homogeneously Chinese, as we see in Amitabha's Tang Dynasty court orchestra, or in the scene of the old man entering retirement in Maitreya's field, or in the very delicately rendered agricultural scenes in the backgrounds that we find here. In some cases, too, we must search further afield to locate the sources of inspiration. Consider, for instance, the figure in the lower right among this group of three, whose lion headdress recalls the garb of the Roman signifier, as seen in a reenactment of a Roman army here. Though antecedents may be found in Assyria, it seems to be in its Hellenistic and Roman iterations that this depiction entered the Buddhist world, for it was the figure of Heracles that surely served as the model for the Gandharan realization of Vajrapani, and then eventually comes into our Cave 25. In its iconographic program, therefore, Anshi Yulin Cave 25 embodies a Buddhist universe that clearly and consciously expresses its embrace of Tibetan, Indian, and Chinese worlds, and includes, too, some gestures that may take us farther afield, even to distant Rome. I believe, therefore, that fulfilling the aspirations expressed in the prayers of the Treaty Temple, it may be taken as a seal of the Tibetan Emperor's august presence, bringing order and bounty to his subjects in this world, and as the living presence of Buddha Vairochana, bringing to fruition the cosmic order as well.
Thank you, Dr. Kapstein. We do have some time for questions. If anyone would like to ask, just raise your hand. We have mics on either side of the house that we can get to you.
I just wanted to ask a question about you in Paris and do you do any research within Paris, or have you taught there? I'm sorry, I don't remember from the beginning.
I taught there until last year. I'm now retired in Paris. I see.
What did you teach?
Tibetan studies.
Tibetan studies.
Yes.
Thank you. Elena?
Thank you so much for very interesting talk. I have a question about Yulin Cave in general. And I wonder if this cosmopolitan nature of the iconography that we saw in the murals that you very nicely presented could be just a reflection of the crossroads of the cultures at this Dunhuang Silk Roads, and the fact that it had so many different political and cultural systems kind of that swept through it and remained and congealed and produced this incredible art.
Well, that's certainly the case. I don't think that there's any contradiction between that and what I've been discussing here. What's important from my point of view is the manner in which the Tibetan Empire, at least in this latter part of the history of the Tibetan Empire, but I think probably beginning with the time of Chisung Detsen, very actively inscribed itself into this internationalized order. And so if you look not just to what's happening in this example of an imperial Tibetan period foundation in the Dunhuang region, but to the records of the Samye Monastery, which is in central Tibet, and not in this region. The Tibetans are always insisting that Samye involves the collaborative work of artisans from Khotan and India and Nepal, in addition to Tibetans, and that there are different artistic styles represented within the program of Samye. So my point about it is, well, yes, it is drawing on a kind of internationalism that's current in the Dunhuang region and throughout the Silk Road areas, but I think that the Tibetans very consciously adopt and accentuate that.
Does anyone else have a question?
Yeah, I hope this isn't too far afield, but I was just wondering from your study, what type of lessons do you derive from about the rise and fall of civilizations, especially as related to people's beliefs?
Well, I'm not so sure in terms of people's beliefs, but in studying the Tibetan Empire, the traditional kind of mythology of the Tibetan Empire holds that the reactions to Buddhism and the persecutions of Buddhism attributed to King Lang Dharma and so forth, that these were the events that were the movers in, if you will, the fall of the Tibetan Empire and so forth. And my own view is that that's really a legendary overlay. Sort of ironically, as someone who was specialized in the history of religions, my study of the Tibetan Empire really moved me toward fairly thoroughgoing economic explanation. And I found the decline and fall of the Tibetan Empire best explained by a structural problem in ancient and medieval empires, which is that empires fueled themselves economically through conquest. Through conquest, they absorbed the surplus of new territories, but of course, once you absorb the surplus and have to be living off of the annual production rather than what's been acquired earlier, the only way to new acquisition is new conquest. And because that process cannot go on indefinitely, there comes a point where an empire stabilizes. It must also be the point at which it begins to implode, right? Because its receipts can no longer equal the receipts generated by new conquest. And you'll note that in my talk here, I emphasize that Tibet reached its greatest extent in about 820 under this ruler Rinpoche. And interestingly, this is the period at which the empire begins to fall back on itself and to weaken. So my hypothesis in essence is to be very careful about deficit spending. I think that to be adopting, in essence, an economic model that's based on an assumption of a pattern of growth that can't be sustained is fatal. And that's what happened here.
Thank you. Do we have a final question?
But let me just add one thing to that, because it needs to tie it in with what, I guess your question was about the religion and so forth. One aspect of Tibet when it was in its growth arc was that it had the resources to very lavishly patronage religion, and to create monasteries, and to sponsor huge translation committees that, the Tibetan National Endowment for the Humanities at the time, right? They translated vast quantities of Buddhist sutras. they were able to finance numerous monks and monastic establishments and the artwork that went with it and so forth and so on. But quite obviously, once the imperial coffers began to empty, and you have that imploding pattern, the sponsorship had to dry up. They could no longer keep it at the same level. And so I think that by the time you have the empire entering into collapse, what's occurred is that they just can't finance the monastic establishments in the same way. And that's what gets recorded then in the later histories as a persecution of Buddhism, right? The resources are just no longer there. The imperial agencies can no longer maintain the monastic establishments and their activities at the level they could earlier. Inevitably, things are reduced, activities are reduced, monks are forced to return to their villages and their families, and so forth and so on. And this then enters the historical record as a persecution of Buddhism.